The nation is sleeping on Washington secondary.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hansen. He writes with me over at Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKDOWNCollege for $20 off your first purchase. And before we get going, just a quick reminder to all you everydayers out there, wherever you get this podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, click that subscribe button, click that little bell as well, so you never miss when we post a new show. Plus, if you're on the audio only side of things, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review, as all that really does help the program out a lot, because now that we're back in fall camp, we have so much more to talk about. Lars, we want to spend some time before Washington puts the pads on Friday, on the third day of practice, as all the everydayers are listening to this. We want to talk about some of the physicality that we've just seen Washington improve on from the spring until now, talk about some of our takeaways from the second day of fall camp. But Lars, I think the biggest thing that we learned from day 2 of practice after getting a chance to talk to Ryan Walters is the secondary is going to be elite, with Tacario Davis and Ephesians Prysock on the outside. And I think this is going to be a bold take after Washington finished second in the nation in passing yards allowed last season. I think this unit is better than that one.
I mean, it has to be strictly off of scheme and coaching, where you have the talent, necessary. I mean, Tacario comes in, Alex McLaughlin, CJ Christian, and safety, but you still have McKell. So you have some experience coming back. He's already in the room with John Richardson and Ephesians and McKell. But adding that trio, that's really what kind of brings this whole secondary together. And then obviously your number one agenda pusher of Rahshawn Clark absolutely should be acknowledging this as well. And so 5, 6, however you want to roll with it, that is why we've been so high on the secondary. And I think why Ryan Walters can now comfortably say, yeah, it was 2 days of fall camp, but I'm pretty sure we're going to have a good secondary. It's because they're all veterans. The Tacario and Ephesians are both seniors. CJ is a senior, McKell's a senior, and Alex McLaughlin is the junior. But they all have high experience in terms of Alex McLaughlin, and AU was playing a lot, so it's not like he's just getting it.
He started as a true freshman for them.
Exactly. And he also had a conversation with Jedd mid-game about that. I think after the game, he joked about that, saying, hey, when I talked to Jedd, yeah, we lost the game. And I was like, hey, I had 10, 11, 12 tackles in that game. So he's always produced against big, major FBS programs. And I think that's why Jedd sought him out. I don't necessarily know how much Walters played a factor in that recruitment there. But obviously, John Richardson knows what he's got in the room, and Ryan Walters can kind of just co-sign on all of it.
So you bring up a great point there, because Alex was the first guy I wanted to talk about, where one of my biggest observations from today, and Ryan Walters very quickly shot it down, but I think it's still worth noting because it's something you and I have talked about a lot with this unit over the summer, is Alex has been taking first team reps in terms of some of this install alongside McKell ahead of CJ Christian. And, when you said number one agenda pusher, I thought that's who you're going to mention, because I have been the Alex McLaughlin guy and I will continue to do so. But I look at Alex as someone who, because all three of these safeties that we've been talking about, McKell, CJ, and Alex, all three of those guys can play both positions. So I think we're going to see several different combinations of those guys, not just in camp, but on the field as well this fall, because that's why you're doing this right now. And I want to bring this back around to the first point I made, because in terms of numbers, allowing 166 yards a game, I think was that number last season. I don't think that's going to end up being the case. I think we're going to see a slight step back in terms of the numbers, but I think in terms of talent, what this group brings to the table, we're going, and a lot of that is because, we've talked about it all week, the step forward that the defensive line and the front seven is going to take. So there's going to be more opportunities for quarterbacks to throw the ball, different things like that could play into these numbers as well. But I just think that all of the talent that this unit brings to the table is a step forward in terms of overall from last season. And on top of that, as you said, the scheme just fits all these guys so perfectly. Tacario Davis said it to us today, where he said, if you want to play press man coverage, this is the place for you to come play it. And it's why, we've been talking so much about Dylan Robinson. Ryan Walters had some very high praise for him today. And I think he also mentioned that he has the largest broad jump on the team in terms of summer conditioning. So that's just something to keep in mind in terms of an explosive athlete. So I look at all that and think that the depth is going to be there as well. And on top of all of this, like mentioning Rahshawn Clark is so important as well. But the fact that The number one thing that we talked about it all spring, John Richardson, Tacario Davis, all these guys, and then it was continued to be emphasized this fall, was turning good plays into great plays. It's creating more turnovers. It's creating more interceptions. That was not something we saw last season, where the team leader in interceptions was Carson Bruner at linebacker with 3. And Carson obviously had a tremendous season, but that's something that you don't want that to be the case. You want these guys on the outside who not only do you want to trust them in one-on-one coverage, but you want to make sure that they're winning those battles. And if they can get more takeaways, it'll do nothing but help this offense, which is obviously going to be the bread and butter of this team.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Carson had 2 in 1 game last season. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
USC.
So, yeah, thank you. And I was like, yeah. So, I mean, again, basically call it 2 games with an interception for your team leader. That's a crime. But I think the other reason that we should probably slightly acknowledge it a little bit is UW got ran over last season. So much like the 21 season with Jimmy Lake, where he could profess, hey, we have the best passing defense in the country. Yeah, great. You're 2-11 because you have no soul up front. Now you have solved that problem. You're going to force teams into those decisions. Do we want to try and run against a 5-man front, or do we want to try and beat this young but also veteran secondary? Because, I think that's what's interesting, going back to your point about Alex, where I don't think there's been any usurp of Alex to CJ or Mikkel to CJ. I think CJ proved himself so well in the spring. They can kind of allow Alex to take some extra reps with Mikkel and say, when you think about it, with the fact that, Alex has that other year coming back, you can kind of work with those pairings. And I think that's more so what it is than CJ losing a step or potentially not being, in that starting role. Because I think,
So none of this is an indictment on any of the guys in the room. I'm glad you put it that way, but it kind of goes back to the debate you and I were having in the spring. It was, which one of these guys is going to get to start? And like the point we were making, and one of the points that I think we're just continuing to try to get across, is it doesn't matter at this point in time. And it's not even just the, whoever's taking the reps, it's not going to matter on game day, that sort of thing. It's not going to matter on the depth chart. No, it's just the coaching staff very clearly has a high level of trust in all 3 of these guys. We're all going to see them playing a lot. And it goes back to something else I remember Taylor May saying in the spring, is that they not only do they trust all 3 of these guys, they trust all 3 of these guys at both positions, at the post and the down safety role. They can all come down to the box and hit, as evidenced with, McEllisteen last year at Indiana. And then we know what CJ can do in the box, close to the line of scrimmage. We know Alex, as you mentioned, he had 160 something tackles over 2 years at NAU, plus all the ball production with 16 pass breakups, 6 interceptions, that sort of thing. You know that all of these guys can produce over the top as well, where CJ had the pick in the spring game. I look at what this whole secondary brings. One of the most experienced pairs of cornerbacks in the country on the outside in Tacario Davis and Ephesians Prysock, which we've just emphasized throughout the offseason. Then you look on the inside, a guy who is probably going to make a name for himself this fall in Rahshawn Clark. And when you combine all of that with what's going on in the secondary and what all 3 of these top safeties, plus a Ryland Dillard Allen, plus, some of these backup corners on the outside in Dylan Robinson, in Leroy Bryant, what all of these guys bring to the table combined, it's something that all rounds out together so well, where I've seen some people online have questions about, like, hey, if one of these guys goes down, what's that going to look like? Ryan Walters told us today, Leroy Bryant can play inside and out. Rahshawn Clark can play inside and out. Don't forget Dyson McCutcheon, who this coaching staff is very, very high on. I look at this unit as a whole, and all of the production is going to be there. And most importantly, you talk about the run defense. It's going to be there as well, too, because this unit can get up close to the line of scrimmage and tackle. That's why that down safety role as well is so, so important. But Lars, there is so much else that we learned on day 2 of fall camp. And we'll get to that right after a message from our friends over at Drip Drop. If you're trying to stay on top of your routine, whether that's workouts, long days on campus, or staying focused through back-to-back classes, hydration is where it all starts. And that's where Drip Drop comes in. Drip Drop is doctor-developed and scientifically proven for fast hydration. It uses the perfect balance of sodium electrolytes and glucose to help your body absorb fluids quickly, delivering 3 times the electrolytes and half the sugar of a leading sports drink. Now, for me, my go-to flavor has been fruit punch. I love a Drip Drop right after I'm done playing basketball. I've struggled with dehydration. Sometimes if I don't get enough fluids in me over the course of some of my pickup games, and it's a game changer after some of those basketball games, Drip Drop comes in clutch for me. Right now, Drip Drop is offering Locked On listeners 20% off your first order. Just head to dripdrop.com and use promo code LOCKEDONCollege. That's dripdrop.com, promo code LOCKEDONCollege for 20% off. Stock up now before the heat hits hard. Lars, one of the biggest things that stood out to me as I continue to watch the offense, where the defense went off to the side field over the course of day two as the offense practice in the stadium, was this first team receiver group. It's something you and I talked a little bit about after day one, but I think it's worth a conversation again on day two, because today the first team receivers during a good portion of the install was Rasheed Williams again, Raiden Vinesbright, and Kevin Green Jr., who is in the slot. And Omari Evans was kind of taking those second team reps in the slot. I think that's something where you might as well kind of let him do that on the second team as well. And then if you still want to try him out at the Z with the first team, you can just use a guy like that in so many different ways. But I thought that was really interesting to note, with Denzel Boston kind of still working off to the side and Chris Lawson over there with him as well for a little bit of practice.
An important context in there, because I think Chris would factor into that discussion with Raiden as well. But again, when we look at Raiden at practice, it's just a guy who always seems to find his way open when he's been on the field.
Yeah.
For much of the spring, he wasn't. But the first 2 days of fall camp, when they were doing the fade drills and things like that, the ball is like a glue to his hand. And so it's going to be hard to keep a guy like that off the field. But then, as we talked about a couple of days ago or yesterday's show, where Jedd said it'll be probably 4 guys. And so how do you find enough targets in there? But again, Raiden's too good to not play this season. It's just a question of how many, when, the situations. Because, again, you reloaded that class, not for this year, but for 26, 27, 28, to have those forces like Denzel stacked up, and kind of just let them marinate this season.
So I can't remember if this is a conversation we had on the show yesterday. I'm sure some of the everydays will remind us, or off the air, because it's something you and I have been talking about for a while, where it's, the 4-man rotation at the top is probably what it's going to look like. But that doesn't mean that some of these other guys who might not make that top end cut aren't going to get on the field and aren't going to get snaps at any point this season, because we saw that with Audric Harris last season. So I think that's something to still keep in mind with all this, where you could still throw some of these other guys out in situational roles, which is something I'm really curious about, because like this coaching staff very clearly just wants to get some of these guys game experience. And it's one of the reasons I've been just saying, I'm at, 6.5 is my over under for freshmen burning their red shirts this season. And I'm taking the over. It's because of plays like that, where not even just a receiver, where we look across this entire 2025 class. And it's, you mentioned it the other day, if Donovan Robinson gets on the field for some special teams work, and he's another guy who I wanted to shout out, because when we asked Ryan Walters about him today, he was very quick to say, he's a linebacker. He's not a safety. So it seems like the plan there is to continue adding weight to his frame and letting him play close to the line of scrimmage and just kind of thrive in that department. So, but it's with guys like that, with Ryland Dillard-Allen, just finding ways to get him on the field no matter what in certain cases, a lot like what they did with Peyton Waters last season. I just look at the plan there, and it, just most evidenced by receiver, in my opinion. They're going to see a lot of these young guys on the field in some way, shape, or form this year.
I agree, but I do think, and I don't disagree with the Audric Harris comparison, because he was the only receiver of the 3 last year to burn his red shirt. But that did come about in a very unorthodox way. Granted, the 24th season was holistically unorthodox for Jedd Fisch in Washington, just based on the context coming into January, all those sorts of things. So it's kind of a rough estimate, because if you remember, I think it was in the spring when Kevin Cummings said, we might have moved Audric around a little too much. Like, he basically got reps at all 3 positions, and that may have actually hindered his potential growth, where we haven't seen him, take a regression this spring and fall, but he hasn't necessarily taken that next step either. And so he's kind of in that, purgatory period of like, can you take that next step, or where are you going to fit in all this discussion?
I mean, not necessarily though, because that was something Jedd Fisch mentioned on Tuesday, where he was very quick to say, obviously we haven't had him for very long, but Audric had a phenomenal summer, the best we've seen from him, kind of thing. And again, small sample size being two summers, but that's still something to note. I more agree with what Kevin Cummings was saying, because it was something you and I talked about when he committed last year. This is a guy who just seems like he's going to work best in the slot, where he can stretch the field from that position, and he can just put pressure on defenses in a variety of ways. And it's something with a lot of freshmen where when you want them to just come in and you do expect them to get on the field early, you might as well start them off with one position and then start to move them around as, camps go on, as the years go on. So that's one thing I'm really curious to see what that's going to look like as fall goes on with someone like Raiden Vinesbright, especially because I think that was something where, you mentioned it yesterday, we wanted to see a little bit more of in the spring, but because he got hurt and he missed so much time, we just didn't really get that opportunity.
And it's unfortunate, but also it's in Raiden's case, it's going to be hard to still get a ton of reps and a ton of, this is more of a, again, the famous buzzword of Jedd Fisch is the foundational year as your freshman year. Kind of just set that bar, see where you can go into 26 because you have Denzel. You have enough guys on the roster in that 2 deep scenario where Raiden should be, kind of viewed as, hey, he's the next man up potentially, but we're not going to rely upon him, but he should still play. So it's in that kind of, we need you to get integrated, but we're not necessarily going to be reliant upon you because of the guys in the offense that we kind of run, where it's 2 receivers get a ton of targets, then there's 2 more guys, and then everybody else is like 8, 5, 7 catches.
Sure. Yeah, so I like where you're going with that. I just want to switch gears because there are a couple other things that I wanted to make sure we touched on. One of them is running back. And it's something where I got some time to chat with Scotty Graham one-on-one during Tuesday's media day. And I kept asking him, and I got to make sure I put that clip up on YouTube and on all our social medias for all the everydayers out there. But one of the things that he kept coming back to, where I was like, hey, tell me about, Jonah, Adam, Jordan Washington. Now tell me about these freshmen, Julian McMahon, Quade Carr. He just kept coming back to the word development. That's what it's all about making sure these guys develop. And you can certainly see that with all of the guys in the room. But what really stood out to me was not necessarily the different ways that they're using players, but just the different styles of bodies that you see where even like, for example, 2 guys that we think are going to do something similar in Jordan Washington and Quade Carr. Quade Carr is just like a lot more filled out in his frame than I think some people might have expected. And obviously Jordan Washington's gotten a lot bigger since he's gotten to campus as well. But I'm just really intrigued by that because I look at this plethora of running backs that you have. You have the group of guys that are just going to thrive between the tackles. Jonah, Adam Muhammad, Julian McMahon fits into that. And then, of course, Jonah and Adam Muhammad have done plenty of work outside of the tackles as well. But then you have this other group of guys, headlined obviously by Jordan Washington and Quade Carr, that's going to be the main source of yardage for them is getting outside the tackle boxes, getting into space, and just doing different things with their speed and athleticism. And I'm really curious to continue to watch this play out. And I thought this could lead perfectly into the conversation we wanted to have about just physicality and different things. Because when the pads go on Friday, I really want to see what these running backs can do because this group just looks so much stronger than it did last season. Where it's, not to knock a guy like Cameron Davis or even where Adam and Jonah were last year. But I just think that it's something that is radiated throughout this entire team is this whole team looks bigger, faster, and stronger. And that was really the first position that stood out to me was that group of running backs where we saw what Jonah went through in the offseason or from winter into spring in terms of his body transformation. And I don't think it's that drastic with anybody else in the room, but it's just something that's very noticeable. This is a Big Ten group of running backs.
Oh, no, I agree. I would throw in Jordan Washington as a guy who got at least significantly bigger given what we saw from him, as a true freshman. He came in last fall and was not like a pencil, but very, very, needed to add some weight. And now it looks like it's certainly a Big Ten caliber back. The other thing with Jonah is perfect, reference from Scotty Graham, what he said, there's a lot of ice cream on that cone. Now it's like there's like no fat on that USDA prime. It is pure meat. Like that, I think also when I was watching the running backs on, I think Wednesday, whichever day it was at this point, looking at watching the running backs go, and they were doing like a quick, bounce drill, whatever it was, and you can just see all of them run with the same mindset that Scotty Graham has. That's the part of development that he wants to lead, where we want different type of backs, but we all have the same mindset where no matter what, you can still cut up, make that decision, go either between the tackles or outside. And I think that was why they, when we talk about recruiting running backs, that's why they want 2 different types at least, where you want that position versatility to where no matter what situation around the field, you have 1 or 2 backs you can lean on at any given time in any given year to make that actually come to fruition.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. But Lars, when the pads go on Friday, the physicality of this new team is going to really stand out. And we'll get to that right after a message from our friends over at Game Time. We've all been there, logging on early and waiting forever for concert tickets to go on sale, only to lose your spot for a show you've been dying to see. Live music should be about making memories, not dealing with the stress of ticket shopping. That's where Game Time comes in. Game Time makes getting concert tickets faster and easier than ever. Prices actually drop as it gets closer to showtime, and you can save up to 60% off with their killer last-minute deals. One thing that I love using Game Time for is their zone deals, and if you're tired of endless scrolling, trying to find the best deal, Game Time's zone deals pick the best seats in your section for you. I couldn't recommend it enough. I love using it going to T-Mobile Park for baseball games especially. Used to watch the Red Sox, used to watch Paul Skeens and the Pittsburgh Pirates. Game Time Zone deals are phenomenal. Take the guesswork out of buying concert and show tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKDOWNCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. Lars, this is something that has been emphasized, and it really got me thinking about a conversation you and I had a long time ago, where I remember leading up to the 2023 Pac-12 championship game. After Washington had secured their spot, it was either you're going to play Oregon or Arizona. And you and I kind of looked at each other at a certain point in time. We were like, would you rather play Oregon than Arizona? Because I remember going down to Tucson in September of 2023, or the team did. I wasn't on that trip, but watching the team go down and take that trip, and just the way that how physical that defensive line was, how physical Tacario, Davis, and Ephesians, Prysock were with that just legendary group of UW receivers. Every single just player on that team just came in with just a true, just road grader kind of mentality, even though they were at home in that game. And I just look at what last year was in terms of the amount of guys you had to bring in through the transfer portal from the spring window. This team is not that team. Jedd Fisch said that they've added over 700 pounds of muscle in the offseason. The average sprint speed of the team went up by like 1.6 miles an hour or something like that. So it really is a bigger, faster, stronger unit, which is going to start in the trenches. And when they put the pads on Friday, I'm just so excited to see how this is all going to play out.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, we almost kind of were concerned at some point in that game in 23 that Arizona might beat UW. Like, they actually hung. Like, that was one of the games where you can point to a UW season where that changed UW, and it also changed Arizona, because I think that's when they went on that 7-8 win streak.
No, I think that was before the USC game, because they lost that one, and then that's when they went on that winning streak.
But I do think truly that was the catalyst of it, just because of the way they fought. As you mentioned,
I agree.
Fought in that game, and I think that was one where, again, I mentioned it on the show, where it's like I always thought Jedd be a great fit. It's like that's what he did at Arizona, and he didn't even have anywhere near the resources at Arizona that he has at UW, which is why we think they can make that jump, because you have John Mills, split from Texas, Champ Lillia, who you beat out USC for, a number of other schools for, as freshmen, that's the group that I'm really intrigued, because we've seen Garen Hatchie get some reps, in the offensive right guard. But when the pads come on, I'm not betting against Champ Lillia or John Mills when you're going up against, again, it's going to be tough for some of these guys we're going up against to, line up against Simone Pepa, things like that. But like, there's just so much, potential in this room, but just so much girth in that unit that it's like, once the pads come on, that could get violent in a hurry.
So I wanted to talk about the other side of the line. So I'm glad you talked about the offensive line there for a second, because this is a group that I feel like I've seen the most questions about from everydayers, and it's why we've spent so much time talking about it over the last couple of weeks. This defensive line is really so much improved from where it was last year in terms of not only the depth, but the talent of the unit as well. Because, people are going to look at it and say, well, what does Anterio Thompson bring to the table? Logan Sagapolu, Simote Pepa, Uiagalelei, Bryce Butler, Omar Khan, Linnaeus Davis, whoever you think is going to be on the field, they all bring a slightly different skill set that meshes so well together, in my opinion. But that's the one thing that all of this group brings, is strength and physicality. And I mean, obviously, right? Like, you're playing the interior defensive line, you have to. But I look at what all of these guys bring to the table, and it all just comes together so well in this Ryan Walters scheme, where it's all about creating these one-on-one matchups. And, talking about John Mills and Champ Lillia, if we see them lose a couple of reps over the first few days, we saw that in the spring as well. And that's what happens with a guy like Anterio Thompson, who, to just throw another college football 26 reference at the everydayers, is probably a pure power type of defensive tackle in terms of what he brings to the table as a pass rusher, especially. But you need those sorts of players combined with a Simote Pepa, who can eat up both A gaps in the run game and take on all those double teams when need be. And I look at this unit as a whole and can't help but think it's ready for a step forward. And, people are going to panic about the offensive line if, we're writing about it and we're talking about it on the show after, on Monday. And it's, the defensive line really stood out. And there are going to be people who are saying, well, what does this say about the offensive line? And I don't think that's going to be my main, concern. It's just, no, this defensive line is just so much more improved. And it's just set up so much, I don't want to say better schematically, because it's not even that it's that much different. It's just, overloading the line of scrimmage a lot more. But I just think that that's going to be something that I want to focus on, is just this pass rush is going to be so much more tenacious than it was last season, not just because you're sending more guys, but because you have more Big Ten caliber players in the trenches.
Yeah, it's something Ryan Walters said on Tuesday, where he's like, I've never been in a position of luxury like this. Not just, in terms of, as I wrote on Huskies, where monetarily, like, you're in a pretty good cushy situation as a DC, basically just calling whatever you want to do. But every position, he's like, yeah, I don't look at any position as a cause for concern. We have guys that are either younger or veterans, and a combination of that we believe could work, where he mentioned it almost like platoons. And that in my head went to the defensive line, where it's like, there's so much different combinations that you can roll with, where you didn't mention Logan Tacapalo, another guy that I'm curious when the pads come on, how does he hang in this year two in this, not in this scheme, but just, at UW, and how does he factor into all this? Because you have so many different types of bodies, plus Uiagalelei, Zach Durfee being healthy, and all these sorts of things. Even without Russell Davis, Jacob Blaine is there. So you have so many different guys that I'm really curious how Ryan Walters can maximize it, because that's why Jedd brought him here. He's one of the best, if not the best defensive coordinators in the country. How can you turn Washington from a what were they, top 40, 50? What's up, 20, 30, right? 30-ish, right? Somewhere in that ballpark?
Somewhere in that ballpark, yeah.
Let's say to a top 15, because I think that's truly where Ryan Walters could have his overall defense at the end of the season, if not higher.
No, I certainly agree with you there. And one thing that I want to make clear to the everydayers, where I'm sure they've seen this in some other places, whether they be, reading the work of some of our fine coworkers like Christian Capel, Andy Yamashita, whoever else. We're through 2 days of practice, and Washington is not lined up for a single scrimmage period yet. So that's one of the reasons that we still have to talk about all of this in the way that we have, because so much of these first couple of days have been focused on installs and just making sure these players are picking everything up, not in a way of just like, oh yeah, it's still at a very basic level like it was last spring and last fall. It's just making sure a lot of these guys are integrated and just kind of know what's going on in terms of the general scheme, and seeing what a lot of these players can do in their first couple of practices, the Dylan Robinsons of the world, right? Just to mention a name we were talking about earlier as well, because there are still so many other things to figure out. But I think this, and just the main point of this conversation here, being the physicality and the strength of this team, is not one thing that these coaches have any concerns about after last season. Like, obviously they're still going to do the whole coach speak answers of, yeah, we've seen all the improvements here, all the improvements there. But I remember it's one thing that Jedd said last spring when he was addressing the team after practice, like, we're in the Big Ten. We need to be bigger, faster, stronger than we were at any point last season, no matter what team you were on, because this is just a different level of physicality. And I think that's one of just the most important things that we've seen that this coaching staff has addressed, is not just making sure they were doing that in the weight room, but one of the good things about last season, just kind of going the way it did, is that a lot of these guys that are back understand what that physicality difference is like now, and how they need to just continue to take their game to the next level, which is just another thing I'm really excited to see when the pads go on.
Exactly. I mean, two guys come to mind. Drew has the party, a right tackle, where now you have a year of physicality experience in the Big Ten. Can you level up? Because last season it was not as great a season, but you give him a path for moving up from the Mountain West to the Big Ten in just 6 months time. He should make a step. And then I look at, a couple of guys along that defensive line. Omar Khan comes to mind, Lenny Davis, those guys, where it's like, hey, you guys now know what it's like as well. There's a number of names you could roll with here. But just the point being, even for some of the young guys below Anterio Thompson, below the obvious veterans that we expect to see on the field come August and September, how much of a jump can they make? Because that's what I believe will separate when all is said and done. Because if Simone Pepa plays up to his freshman potential that he showed at Utah, that's what we expect. If Anterio Thompson proves that he's a Big Ten player like he was trying to be at Iowa, but maybe didn't truly get the chance when Kirk Ferentz to show what he could do on defense, prove it this year for Ryan Walters, who, by the way, again, has Big Ten experience. So I think that's another quick factor to say Ryan Walters got the players. He knows the physicality. He knows how to combat it. So I think it's a match made in heaven.
No, I couldn't agree with you more there. One last thing that I want to mention is just something you said about Simote Pepa right there, because he's someone else. So I think we've both been banging the drum for a lot over the offseason, because I'm sure there are some people who might hear, playing at his potential that he was as a redshirt freshman when he was an all Pac-12 first team player, and say, well, hey, that was like 3 years ago. I think that one of the things that may have gotten lost in everything that we're talking about in terms of depth is that he is one of the players that this helps the most. Where a stat I like to reference is I think he got a little banged up in week 1 of 2024 when he was playing for Utah. He played 55 snaps in that game. And I think if you look at PFF's snap count tracker for the next 4 weeks, he didn't even get to like 30. So he was clearly banged up in some way, shape, or form. And that's been the biggest problem there, is making sure he stays healthy. And the way this defensive line is set up with such a heavy rotation, which is why we've emphasized it so much, it's having all that strength and all that physicality is great. But if it's not healthy, it's all going to come crumbling down really fast. So having so many guys that can rotate through and play 15, 20, 25 snaps a game, somewhere in that ballpark and not much more, like, if somebody emerges and let's just say it's Anterio Thompson, right? And he can take 40 snaps a game. Great. You're going to be more than happy with that. But if all of these guys are just playing 20 to 25 snaps a game and rotating like hockey lines and still finding a way to make an impact, you're going to be more than happy with that at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, if that's where the production comes from, that's where it comes from. Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all everydayers tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. We got so much more fun stuff coming for you throughout camp. So please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcast. So that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel with new content every single day. So please make sure you click that like button, click that little bell, so you never miss when we post a new video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop them right down below in the comment section. And if you're audio only, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review, as it does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Monday.